hobby friends. Heck yes, new Eldar. Today we are going to celebrate the glorious refresh of some of Warhammer 40k's most gorgeous models by painting up some all-plastic, properly scaled and beautifully crisp Warp Spiders. As you will have seen in the thumbnail, I am going with a traditional colour scheme, and what better way to start a mostly red colour scheme than with blue? Yes, old friends will know that I'm up to my usual nonsense, and new friends, don't worry, I promise it will all make sense in the end. I am no fan of sub-assemblies, but in the case of our arachnid friends here, those warp generators are just a little too in the way to stick straight on. Plus, the thought of trying to hand paint a nice black gradient across 10 of them is not filling me with hobby joy. So off they stay. When the blue is done, I moved on to a more predictable colour for a red scheme, red. A nice bright primary one from Molotow. As per usual, you can find all the paints I use listed in the description below. This red will obviously form the core of the scheme, but we don't want to lose that blue information, so I'm careful here to keep all those downward facing areas and shadowy bits nice and blue. For the colour nerds out there, what we're playing with here is using chromatic contrast rather than value contrast to make our shadows. That means instead of our shadows being a darker version of the mids and highlight colour, they're a similarly bright, highly contrasting hue. Blue is not the direct complementary of red, see my video on the colour wheel for more info on that, but it is a quintessentially cool colour and generally works beautifully as a shadow. I'm using this really punchy red as my mid-tone base because I know there are some additive steps coming that will bring down that saturation, and I don't want to end up in Brown Town. With the main red down, it's time to move on to the highlights, but not with a lighter red. Oh no, we are going in with a really punchy yellow. You'll want to narrow down that focus even more on this step, keeping the yellow just for those upper surfaces and generally the top part of the mini. One really simple trick I see people miss for giving their minis a more dynamic look is to properly grade the brightness across the whole of the mini rather than just the individual volumes. What I mean by that is that the highest highlight on, say, the foot should be significantly darker than the highlight on, say, the shoulders. Doing this helps sell the scale of the figure, making it feel like a big thing drawn small rather than what it actually is, a little plastic war toy. Now, those yellows might look a little jarring at the minute, but this next step is going to bring everything together. Into my airbrush, I've loaded some bright magenta contrast paint. I'm using GW's super punchy Doomfire magenta. This transparent overcoat is going to bring the yellow down into a nice warm, high orange red. It'll help bring the red and blue together by amping up those purple transition tones, and it will enrich and cool off the mid-tone core. It might be tempting to just blast this overcoat all over, but especially with highly staining pigments like this Doomfire, try and exercise your brush control a bit and work up delicate layers. This extra control will help you keep all of the character of those underpainted steps. If you're less confident with your airbrush, well, step one is to go watch Marco Frassoni's airbrush intro videos, because for my money those are the best ones out there. And in the meantime, feel free to thin your paints with a little medium or water so each spritz does a little less work, giving you the space to climb up those gradients slowly. Rightio, that's all the core red work done. Let's smash out some backpacks now, nice and quick. This is just a black primer, followed by some more black. Vallejo's airbrush version of their model color black, my favorite hobby brand black, and a super handy paint to have because I have the regular and airbrush version, so matching for touch-ups later is nice and easy. And then over that I add some of this. Molotow call this Lago Blue Pastel, but any very pastel, cool green or blue will do. The key is you want something pretty close to white, but with just a hint of chromatic information in there. And probably something from the cooler end of the spectrum as well. This goes on in a fairly bold stripe across the hump of the backpack, a positioning that will help sell this as a slightly shiny material, as opposed to a direct top-down highlight, which would make it feel a little more matte. You might be thinking, that's a pretty bold highlight color there, Mr. GRG, and you'd be right, but don't worry, we're going to pull it right back now with some Black Lotus Xpress paint from Vallejo. That's their equivalent to GW's contrast range. This two-step approach allows you loads more control over the intensity of the highlight without demanding too much skill or time. I would caution against trying to do it with a pure white highlight though. It may seem counterintuitive, but the thing that will help sell your black highlights is using a desaturated but still chromatically active paint. And the same definitely applies for regular brushwork as well, as you'll see later when I get onto the edge highlights. Now, I would really like to cut to some footage of the next step here, but unfortunately I somehow seem to have not hit record or deleted it because that footage is missing. The step was pin lining with a very, very dark red to add some definition to all those armor panels and nooks and crannies, and I did it with oil paints, which are a real dream for adding definition to fine details, especially after airbrushing. If you're not familiar with oils for panel lining, cue up my now pretty ancient but inexplicably popular Fire Prisms video to watch after this one. Link down below. Okay, that was all the major base work done. Time for the slog, blocking in the other major colors. I'm starting with black for the spinners, which takes an age, but is a good opportunity to zone out to some tunes or audiobooks or YouTube videos or whatever you're into. And then, the part that I've been dreading a bit, those white helmets. To be honest, this was probably some bad planning on my part. When I saw the minis, I assumed the whole of the helmet would be one bit, and I resigned myself to painting white by hand. In fact, those white parts of the helmet are a separate bit on the sprue, and the little bit of red for the mouthpiece and side bumps I certainly could have painted by hand much faster. But somehow I'd already come to terms with the idea of hand painting the white instead, and stuck the helmet parts together without really thinking. If I had a do-over on these, I think I would definitely leave those parts off so I could airbrush the white, a much faster way of doing this with no compromise on the look. Oh well, it's probably character building for a painter to hand paint white from a dark base every now and then. My strategy this time, which I tried for the first time and worked out okay, was to use this Molotow white, which as far as whites are concerned is a pretty opaque option that only took 4 coats or so to work up to an acceptable coverage. One more main element to lay down now, and that is our metallics. Regular viewers will know my go-to metallics for brushing on are the pretty unbeatable Scalecolor, Metal and Alchemy sets. I'm laying down the darkest warm metallic here to act as the base for a nice bronze tone. And since they're out and my rinse water is getting increasingly contaminated with mica pigments anyway, let's burnish those up to a nice bright finish by layering on increasingly brighter shades. The key to really good-looking true metallic metals is to paint them like non-metallic metals. That is to say, to start with a nice dark base and work up some intense highlights. You can see on my palette here that I went for 4 stages, right up to a super pale yellow metallic for some specular highlights at the end. The results will make the metals look beautiful and shiny. All that white work earlier was all well and good, but we're left with a pretty undefined blob now, right at the main focus point of the mini, i.e. the head. So let's solve that by adding in some shading with the help of this space grey from Vallejo's Xpress line again. This pastel blue will work wonders in the shadows for white, but I have thinned it quite heavily with medium to allow myself room to build up layers. As always with contrast type paints, the trick is to work quickly and confidently, moving the paint around while it's still wet and trying to end brush strokes in corners and edges to avoid coffee stain lines. I'm wrapping this shadow from one side of the head around the back and down the other side, which really helps tighten up the form of the helmets and gets us some much needed definition on those details. By the time I get to the 10th one, the first one is dry and ready for another more focused layer, building up some deeper shadows. Spoiler alert, it's really hard to take photos of white, especially when it's sitting right next to dark reds and blacks. So you might just have to take my word for it that this step makes a huge difference to the appearance of the mini. A few touch-ups where the shadows overshot, and that's the white all done. Next up, the black highlights. We're going back to what I mentioned earlier about building your black highlights with a chromatic element. These kinds of pastel tone paints have loads of white pigment in them, so you will easily build a grey, and the colour pigments give the black a proper sense of depth, something an achromatic grey can't do for you. Of course, you could always mix white and black and a hint of whatever colour you're after, but half the work is already done for you if you choose the right mixer for your black from the start. If things start to feel a little too colourful after you put it on the Mini, you can always add a touch more white to desaturate again. I'm really focusing just on the edges here to really define those lovely weapon forms. 2 passes will do for a 10-man squad, one slightly darker followed by a narrower, slightly lighter pass. You can see here how green that higher highlight colour looks on the palette, but hopefully you'll agree that on the Mini the effect still reads very much as black. Time to touch up the red, and why not pack in a little more color magic for you in this video? We're going to look at some chromatic black. Briefly, a chromatic black is what you get when you mix 2 fully saturated, usually complementary colors and make a black, or near black, out of them. It has loads of uses. In fact, it was nearly exactly this mix but in oil paints that I used for the panel lining step earlier. But here, I'm just using it to get close to the complicated tones we have in those mixed blue meets red areas. And while we're here, let's bolster up those reds with the red paint that I've put on the palette. Man, I had nearly forgotten what a beautiful paint Kimera's The Red is. Gorgeous. I use that same red to throw in some initial edge highlights, and when that's all done, I mix the red with a touch of white and have fun laying in some extreme edge highlights. There's a fear out there that white in red will make your highlights too pink and you'll end up making the Mini feel more rosy than red. But as long as you hold back and use this pink colour sparingly right at the top end, you should be fine. In fact, it should bolster your bold red bodies. Next detail is the weapon heads, which I treated pretty simply on these guys, underpainting with the same blue, red and yellow steps as the rest of the body earlier, but skipping the magenta overcoat. Instead, after applying some wispy monofilament zigzags in pure white, I flooded each panel with fluorescent pink. Fluoro paints are invariably very transparent, so all that stuff underneath still shows through, and by flooding like this, the paint pools in the corners and gives a sort of quick and dirty OSL-ish effect. I could have invested more time on these bits maybe, but we can save that for a special character sometime maybe. Nudge nudge wink wink. And other than some basing and a handful of extra details, we are basically done here. I was hoping to smash these out over the course of the weekend they arrived, but I ended up getting a little absorbed in some of the later stages. So from sprue to finished Mini ended up being 2 days and a couple of evenings instead. Painting the heads separately and cutting some corners here and there could get that time down if time is important to you, but hey, I enjoy painting, so it's time well spent if you ask me. But what do you think? Here are the finished Minis in all their glory. I would have done blue shadows anyway, but they actually ended up working really well as underlight from the warp lightning basing elements as well. And while this isn't a groundbreaking scheme for the Warp Spiders, I hope I've done some Reborn classics proud. Let me know what you think, leave a like if you liked, subscribe if you want to see more of my stuff, tell me which of the Aspect Warriors you think I should work on next, help support my video making endeavors with the thanks button under the video, and if you're into cool groups of awesome hobby people, check out the link to our Discord server in the description below. Cheers for watching, and I will see you next time.